it's my great joy to welcome our Reverend Paul Johnson, who is going to be speaking to us today about 6 sources and 7 principles.
It's great to be with you again this morning. And, as I look back to the General Assembly in Philadelphia in 1981, I realized that the most significant issue was a change in our purposes and principles that had been established in 1961 at the amalgamation of the Unitarians and the Universalists. And it was a challenging issue because the Women in Religion Caucus had suggested that there be changes. Many of them were simply to change the sexist language, from man to more inclusive language. But the other one was to eliminate God, the word God, from the principles, because the Women in Religion Caucus said that the symbol God had become a sexist symbol. And this caused an uproar in the assembly. There were some congregations that said, if you take God out of our purposes, we'll leave this denomination. And I think they meant it. Well, wiser head prevails and said, I think we need to appoint a committee and look at this whole issue and see where we want to go. And so and we made Time magazine about the denomination that wanted to remove God from its principles. Well, what happened was that a commission was established to look at it, and there was a great compromise. It divided our statement of purpose into 2 sections. One was 7 basic principles, and the other were a statement of the sources from which we drew. And this was suggested by Harry Haler, who was minister of one of the Christian Unitarian Universalist congregations in Massachusetts, who said, let's not put God in the first section of the principles, but let's put God in the sources, because no one can dispute the fact that God has been very important and still very important to many people in our association. So I want you to turn in what I gave you today to those that, and I think we've handed them all out, to the current Article 2 on page 17. And you see, just at the bottom there, in our current statement of purposes and principles, the sources section, which says our living tradition draws from many sources, and there we have it, Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. And so this change sailed through the General Assembly in Columbus, Ohio in 1984 by a majority vote, and then in Atlanta the following year by more than 2/3. And so this has been our statement of purposes and principles, including the principles and the sources, since 1985. In 1995, one more was added to the sources, and that was the spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions. So that has been what has been our statement of purpose as a denomination or association since that time. And I think it's served us very well. How many love these purposes and principles? I just love them. And I was so surprised as a Unitarian Universalist that they sailed through, because there was so much preparation done in individual congregations and in districts and in workshops at General Assemblies from 1981 through 1984, that there was a great deal of consensus. But someone stood to make an amendment. Oh, I said, what's going to happen now? Are we going to be at each other's throats? And Paul LaRue, a minister, got up and said, I want to add respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we're a part. And no one objected. It was passed by acclamation. Can you believe that? After 3 or 4 years of discussion and debate, that was added on the floor. And I don't know if I had a chance to thank Paul for that. I think I did over the course of the years, but because that's been very important to us as an ecological principle to which we're committed. So that's where we are. Now, a commission was appointed by our Board of Trustees to look at the purposes and principles to see if they needed updating, because that's required every 15 years or so. And so they have provided us with a new proposed revision, which will be considered at this General Assembly in Pittsburgh coming up in June. And I will be there as a delegate. We, as a ministerial delegate, we can have 2 other delegates who can go. Now, you don't have to be present. You can take part online, right? And we're allowed to have two delegates. So if you're interested in that, see our president, Beth, and she will tell you all about that. So what I wanted to do this morning is give my brief reaction to these suggested changes, and then have a little time for discussion this morning. Now, I go to General Assembly with an open mind on this, and I'm sure there will be spirited, informed debate. I look forward to it. That's one of the things I've always appreciated about General Assembly is the spirited and informed debate. And before and I'm sure there will be a lot of amendments and so forth suggested. But I would just like to share with you a couple of my responses to the way things stand right now. And I'd like you to turn to the current statement on page 18. Now, one of the purposes suggested here in our existing is in C 2.2 purposes is to organize new congregations. And that is not included in the revisions. And I think this is a mistake. I took the extension training ministry block of training back, and I think it was 1980, and then went on to help a congregation that got started in Virginia. But that was a well-funded and organized effort of the denomination to form new organizations, new UU organizations. And that has withered on the vine. We don't have an active extension program anymore. And I would just hate to have that entirely eliminated from our statement of purposes, that we don't have that as one of the primary responsibilities and opportunities for our association to organize new congregations. And then I wanted you to turn to page 19, where we have the proposed section 2.1. And you notice the second paragraph, the purpose of the Unitarian Universalist Association is to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. And I think that's wonderful, but it shouldn't be the sole purpose of the Unitarian Universalist Association. The celebrated author E.B. White once wrote, he said, "I awake each morning with the desire both to savor the world and to save the world. It makes it difficult to plan my day." I think it's important for the UUA to enhance and help and encourage congregations to enable members to both savor the world and to save the world, to appreciate the world through wonder, through our relationships. John Stuart Mill, the famous philosopher, in his autobiography writes of how as a young man, he was totally committed to what his father and Jeremy Bentham proposed as social justice changes within English society. But he came into a period of real depression because he realized if all of these purposes had been realized for social justice change, he still would not be happy. And he went into a deep depression until he discovered Wordsworth's poetry and music, food for his soul in addition to the social justice commitments he had made. I think we always have to keep that in mind, to both savor the world and to save and transform the world. Okay. And then I have a little trouble with the use of the word love. What a splendid thing love is, but it's a multifaceted term. And when you put love at the center of all the suggested values which are enumerated, as you see on page 20, if you'll turn to page 20, and love is mentioned in the existing purposes and principles a number of times, but it's more of an emphasis in the proposed changes. Well, love, if you go back, even to the Greek terms, you have a sexual word for love, eros. You have a word for love as friendship or affection, philia. You have sort of divine love, agape, which means treating everyone with inherent worth and dignity in terms of justice, equity, and compassion, which are our first two existing principles. And I think it's important to have a definition of what sort of love that's being talked about here. And if you're talking about affection and friendship, for instance, in congregation and advancing these principles, I've been involved with congregations where some people there's not a whole bunch of affection, but people still are able to live together and work together for their higher goals, and in terms of agape love or inherent worth and dignity. So I would like that to be further pointed out. And then, and it might be a minor point, but I would like you to turn again to the proposed changes on page 19. The Unitarian Universalist Association is an association of congregations and not individuals. And on C 2.2, it says, as Unitarian Universalists, we covenant. That's not strictly the case, because Unitarian Universalists are not members of the UUA. Unitarian Universalist congregations are members of the UUA. And then the final thing that I wanted to share with you is the fact, the penultimate thing I want to share with you is that when I go through all the suggested values, and you have them listed, on page 20 and 21, interdependence, pluralism, justice, transformation, generosity, equity. You can pair up all of those suggested values or changes to 6 of the existing principles. One is missing, and that is what was in the 1985 revision as support for a world community of justice, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. That's missing in the proposals. And I think that's been an important thing in terms of our history and what we're committed to doing, is to work. I just learned this past week that the Unitarian Universalist Association has withdrawn its support for our United Nations office at the UN. And that grieves me. I think that should be one of our core purposes, is to work for world community. The last thing I wanted to share with you is the fact that I'm very unhappy about our 6 sources being dropped. And here I just want to turn to one of my respected colleagues who was very much involved in establishing the wording of the current 6 principles. This is George Kimmick Beach, who is a retired minister. He says, the elimination of the sources section undercuts the very concept of covenant. A covenant is a mutual commitment to, quote, walk together in ways to come, rooted in gratitude and affection for all we have received from our spiritual heritage. And it says the sources section in the present Article 2 names the spiritual traditions in which our basic values named as 7 principles are rooted. For brevity's sake, I'll reduce the 6 sources to a few phrases. They are: number 1, wonder, the intuitive sense of it, transcendence; 2, compassion, the prophetic call to justice; 3, universality, insights of the religions of all peoples; 4, biblical faith, love of God and love of neighbor as oneself; 5, humanism, rational and scientific integrity; and 6, naturalism, our interdependence with nature. This is a multifaceted heritage, the gift we are grateful for. It underlies and supports our valued commitments, our task. He said the proposed Article 2 offers a single sentence, and you can see that if you turn to the proposal, and it is, we draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundations of love. And says Dr. Beach, this does not root these heritages in identifiable historical sources, but leaves them as a free-floating spirituality. This is a pale reflection of the multifaceted living tradition we know and treasure. And I agree with him. I really grieve the loss of the 6 sources. And of course, they can be added to over time, the way we added nature-based religions in 1995. So that's my response, and I'm going to be going to General Assembly with those issues in mind, maybe even venturing to offer an amendment, who knows. But I await your response. What do you folks have to say?